Chapter 8 Two Old Women. Before the men left the next day, the women packed large bundles of dried fish, enough to restore the people's energy for travel. Meanwhile, the chief waited anxiously. He feared that something had happened to his men, yet he kept intruding upon that thought. And when the men returned, the chief quickly gathered the council to hear their story. The guide told the stunned people what they had discovered. When they had finished the story, he told them what the women did not trust them and did not want to see them. Daggoo told them of the terms the women had set, and after a few minutes of silence, the chief said, "We will respect the old women's wishes. Anyone who disagrees will have to fight me." Daggoo was quick to join in. "The young man and I will stand by you." The council members who had suggested abandoning the two old women were deeply ashamed. Finally, one of them spoke. "We were wrong to leave them behind, and they proved it so. Now we will pay them back with respect." After the chief announced the news to all, the people agreed to follow the rules set by the women. After their energy was restored by the nourishing of the dried fish, the people began to pack, for they could not wait to see the two old women. And in time, the hardship of the news of their survival filled with the band a sense of hope and awe. Chagdasa's daughter, Azi wept when she heard the news. She had believed her mother to be dead, but knew, despite her own overwhelming relief, that her mother would never forgive her. Shirzu was so ecstatic that when he heard the news, the young boy immediately gathered his things and was ready to go. It took the band quite a time to reach the camp where the bark had been stripped off the birch trees. The chief and Daggoo had gone ahead to meet with the two old women. And when they had arrived at the women's camp, the chief had to contain himself from embracing them. The women eyed him with distrust, and they sat down to talk instead. The women told the chief what they expected from the people, and he responded by telling them that their wishes would be obeyed. "We will give you enough food for the people, and when it becomes low, we will give you more food. We will give you small portions at this time," Saad told the chief, who nodded his head almost humbly. It took another day before the band reached the new camp, unpacked and set up the tents, and then the chief and his men arrived with the bundles of fish and rabbit and fur clothing. Daggoo had hinted so boldly that the women were in poor condition of the band clothing after he had spotted their large collection of rabbit fur garments. The women knew both they would never use so many mittens and head coverings, blankets and vests, that they had made so many in their spare time, so they felt obligated to share those with who needed them. After the people settled down in their new camp and their bellies no longer cried out for nourishment, they became more curious of the two old women, but they were forbidden to go near the camp. The colder days came and stayed for a long time, and the people carefully rationed the food, and the old women shared. Then the hunters killed a large moose and hauled it many miles back to the camp, where all rejoiced for good fortune. All this time, the chief and the guide took turns making daily visits to the women. When it became apparent that the two women were also curious about the people, the chief asked for permission for others to visit too. Chagdasa was the first to say no, for her pride was the strongest. But later, the two women talked about it and admitted to themselves that they were all ready for visitors. This was especially true for Chagdasa, who missed her family terribly. And when the chief arrived the next day, the two old women told him of their decision, and soon people began visiting. At first they were timid and unsure, but after a few visits they also talked more easily and soon laughed, and the light-hearted chatter could be heard from inside the shelter. Each time the visitors came, they brought the two women gifts of moose meat or animal furs, which the women accepted gratefully. Relations became better between the people and the two old women. Both learned that from their hardship a side of the people emerged and that they had not known. The people thought themselves to be strong, yet they had become weak, and the two old ones, whom they thought to be the most helpless and useless, had proven themselves to be strong. Now an unspoken understanding existed between them. The people found themselves seeking out the company of the two women's advice to learn new things. Now they realized because the two old women had lived so long, they knew a lot more than the people had believed. Visitors came and went daily and then to the women's camp. Long after they left, Chagdasa would stand and stare after them. Sa watched her and felt pity for her friends, for she knew Chagdasa expected to see her daughter and grandson, but they did not come. Chagdasa harbored a secret fear in her heart that perhaps something had happened to them, and the people did not want to tell her, but she was afraid to ask. One day, as Chagdasa was gathering food, a young voice came from behind her and said softly, "I've come for my hatchet." Chagdasa stood slowly, and her wood frame arms fell unnoticed to the ground as she turned. They stared at each other almost as if it was a dream they could not believe. Faces wet with tears, Chagdasa and her grandson stared at each other in happiness, and no words seemed to be worth speaking at that moment. Without further hesitation, Chagdasa reached out to embrace this young boy who she loved. Sa stood by, smiling and happy at the happy reunion. The young boy looked up to see Sa and went over to her and gave her a gentle hug. Sa felt her heart swell with love and pride for this youngster. Still, Chagdasa wondered about her daughter. Despite all that had happened, Chagdasa yearned to see her own flesh and blood. Being the observant one, Sa knew this, and this was why her friend was sad, despite her good fortune. One day after another of the grandson's visits, Sa reached over and grasped her friend's hand and said, "She will come." She simply, and Chagdasa nodded her head, although she did not quite believe it. Winter was almost over. A well-trodden path lay between the two camps. The people could not get enough of the old women's company, especially the children, who spent many hours laughing and playing at the camp while the old women sat beside their shelter and watched. They were grateful to have survived to witness this. No longer did they take each day for granted. The young grandson came every day. He helped the grandmothers with their daily chores as before and listened to their stories. And one day the older woman could wait no longer and finally announced with courage and asked, "Where is my daughter? Why has she not come?" The young boy answered honestly, "She is ashamed, grandmother. She thinks you have hated her since the day we have turned our backs on you. She has cried every day since we parted," the young boy said as he put her arms around her. "I'm worried about her, for she making herself old with grief." Chagdasa sat and listened. Her heart went out to her daughter. Yes, she had been very angry. What mother would not be? For all those years she had trained her daughter to be strong, and only to find her training had been for nothing. Yet Chagdasa thought, too, of herself. She is not to be blamed for everything. After all, everyone had participated, and her daughter had acted out of fear. She had been frightened for her son and her mother's lives. It was simple as that. Chagdasa also acknowledged that her daughter had been brave to leave the bundle of babachi for the two old women. To have left such a thing of value to the old ones to be near death would have been a foolhardy waste. Yes, she could forgive her daughter. She could even thank her, for she decided that it had not been for the babachi, the two might not have survived. Chagdasa broke out of her thoughts and realized that her grandson had waited for her to say something. Putting her arms around his shoulders and patting them gently, "Tell my daughter I do not hate her, grandson." Relief flooded the boy's face, for he had spent months worrying about his mother and grandmother. Not everything was almost the way it was once. Without furious further encouragement, the boy gave his grandmother an exuberant hug and bolted out of the shelter and ran all the way home. He arrived at the camp breathless, bursting in on his mother with excitement and said, "Mother, grandmother wishes to see you. She told me that there are no hard feelings." Ozo Neely was stunned. She had not expected this, and for the moment her legs became weak and she had to sit down. Her body trembled. "Is this true?" she said to Zhurzu. Replied, and his mother saw that he spoke the truth. At first she was afraid to go, for she felt guilty, but her son's gentle insistence, Ozo Neely, gathered enough courage to take the long walk to her mother's camp. With her son at her side, when they arrived, the two old women were standing outside the shelter. Sa saw the visitors first, and then Chagdasa turned to see what caused silence. When she saw her daughter, her mouth opened, but the words would not come. Instead, the women stared at each other until Chagdasa walked over to Azonili, embraced her tightly, and wept. All that had stood between them seemed to vanish with that touch. Sa stood with her arms around Shurzud, tearfully watching the mother and daughter find love that was almost forever. Then Chagdasa turned and walked into the tent, returning with a small bundle that she pressed into her daughter's hand. Ozonili saw that it was Babachi. She did not understand until Chagdasa leaned forward and whispered something to her daughter's ear, and Ozonili looked surprised at that moment, and she too smiled. Again the women fell into each other's arms and embraced. After everyone had been reunited, the chief appointed the two women honorary positions in the band. At first, people wanted to help the old ones in any way they could, but the women would not allow much assistance, for they enjoyed their newly found independence. So the people showed their respect for the two old women by listening to what they had to say. More hard times were to follow, for in the cold lands of the north it could be no other way. But the people kept their promise. They never again abandoned any elder. They had learned a lesson taught by those who had They had learned a lesson taught by two who had come to love and care for each other, and each died a truly happy old woman. Page 137, about the Gwich'in people. The people in Velma Wallace's had written about, and two old women are part of the Gwich'in band that roam about and around Fort Yukon in Chakalistik, one of 11 distinct Elizabethan groups in Alaska. The Gwich'in people are found in western interior along the Yukon, Porcupine, and Tanana rivers. About 1900, the Abasban people began to settle in more permanent camps and villages, and this was a result of such factors as population declines brought on by disease, involvement in the fur trade, and access to trading posts, and later enforced school attendance. Even today, although many people work for wage labor and actively participate in the market economy, subsistence, living off the land, continues to be a vital component for life for most Alaskan Athabascans.